Hi, everybody. How many's been to the Library of Congress before? Awesome. How many have been here before to the book festival? Awesome. How many of you have read one or more of Christopher's books? Okay, awesome. So I hope you have some really good questions prepared for afterwards. My name is Gohain Mohammed. I'm part of CoStar Group. We're one of this year's sponsors for the Library of Congress's National Book Festival. But before that, I worked at the Library of Congress for almost 9 years doing programming in the Young Reader Center, Visitor Services, and then Signature Programs Office. So it's really nice to be back here in a full, really strange position. I think when most people first get a phone call saying that they have the opportunity to introduce someone that they read when they were younger, you think they'd be really excited. I'm really nervous. Because, you don't want to mess it up. You want to do it justice. Someone who people have looked up to and read and loved and enjoyed from age 8 or 9 to 19 to 29, 39, however old you might be. I think it's really fantastic that we've all come together to embrace his work, and I just want to make sure I do it justice. But I thought, who probably has done it the best? I went to the Library of Congress's website and pulled his bio, so I'm going to read that for you. Christopher Paolini is a best-selling author and creator of the world of Eragon and the Fractalverse. His best-selling fantasy series, Inheritance Cycle, has sold more than 40 million copies worldwide. He's also the Guinness World Record holder for the youngest author with a best-selling series at the age of 19. So, a lot to live up to. His science fiction novels have included To Sleep in a Sea of Stars and The Fractal Noise, featured at the 2024 National Book Festival. Murtagh, which is probably the reason why most of you are here, is his latest addition to the world of Eragon and his sequel to Inheritance. I do want to make a shameless plug. The deluxe edition of Murtagh is out October 15th with a lot of cool new things, so please make sure to pick that copy up. And honestly, I'm just honored and humbled that the library reached out to me and asked me if I would introduce Christopher Paolini. And without further ado, the reason why you're here, Christopher Paolini.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here. I am incredibly excited to be here and rather lucky to be here because yesterday morning I got picked up and got taken to the airport in Bozeman, Montana at an ungodly early hour because my thought was, well, it'd be nice to get here to DC, before midnight and have dinner with my lovely editor and just generally make the travel nice and interesting. So get through security, get to the airplane, get on the airplane, get buckled in, have a little water, taxi out, we're the next plane about ready to take off, and the plane doesn't move. And the captain gets on the intercom and announces that the brakes are frozen. And they're going to have the maintenance come out to the plane and try to bleed off some of the hydraulic pressure on the brakes, and that should get the plane moving. And so, 10 minutes later, maintenance comes out and bleeds off the pressure of the hydraulics, and the brakes will not release. So they say, well, we're going to try a few other things, and nothing works. And to the point where that plane was frozen on the tarmac, and they had to bring out the motorized staircase and bring us off the airplane, take us onto a repurposed school bus, which, by the way, for those of you who don't know, I was homeschooled. So yesterday morning was the very first time in my life that I have ever gotten to ride in a school bus. And all I got to say is, y'all have my condolences. So we go back to the airport, and my awesome publicist, Josh, managed to rejigger some flights and get me on a new flight that got me to Denver, that got me to DC, which got me to my hotel here at about 12:20 last night. And by the time I got food, it was about 3 a.m. So if I stop making sense up here today, or if I keel over, that's why. So I really am grateful to be here today and to be talking about the books. And I'm very, very happy that you've chosen to come here today. And hopefully I will entertain you and maybe interest you. And if I start boring you, you let me know and I will do handstands up here instead. You think I'm joking, I'm not. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got into reading and writing, how I got into writing The Inheritance Cycle and what that process was like, a little bit about the series itself. I'm going to talk about Murtagh. If you're interested, we can talk about spaceships as well. That's always fun. Then I'm going to do a couple of short readings, and assuming I haven't started boring you at that point, we'll do some Q&A. And hopefully we'll have fun along the way. So you see me here today as a published author, and I've been doing this for, over 20 years at this point. And you might think to yourself, well, Christopher's a writer, and he's been doing this forever. He must have always enjoyed reading and writing. Well, the truth is, when I was very young and I was learning how to read and write, I absolutely hated it, loathed it. I couldn't see any possible use for putting all these strange marks on the paper. And I remember marching up to my mom, because, again, I was homeschooled, so my mom was my teacher, a very good teacher, I might add. But I remember marching up to her and saying, I hate to read. I'm never going to use reading for the rest of my life. Now, fortunately for me, my mom didn't listen to me, and she kept teaching me, even up to the point of making me read Green Eggs and Ham in front of everyone in the family, which, that was traumatic. I do not like green eggs and ham, said Sam I Am. And I continued to dig my heels in until one day, my mom took me to the local public library. Now, at the time, we were living in Anchorage, Alaska, which, if you've never been to Alaska, it's an amazing place. The scenery's gorgeous. In fact, I remember during the summertime, our neighbors would be out mowing the lawn at midnight because there was still light in the sky. And then in the wintertime, the sun just kind of comes up for 3 or 4 hours, looks around and goes, nope, and goes right back down. Oh, and I don't know if you know this, but they actually have a different species of mosquito in Alaska. It's true. And they're about this big. And because of the permafrost, you get all these pools of standing water everywhere during the spring and summer. And so these huge black clouds of mosquitoes breed up out of them. And they're like clouds of attack drones. And one of my earliest memories is being in one of the local parks in Anchorage and my mom grabbing me, scooping me up, and running while we were being chased by one of these buzzing black clouds of mosquitoes. And of course, if they catch you, they'll suck all of the blood out of your body and leave nothing behind but a desiccated corpse. Aside from that, a nice place. Yeah, I once got chased by a moose there as well, but I didn't get bitten by a moose, so that was a plus. Anyway, so my mom took me to the local library. As I was going around in the children's section, I was just wandering around, and for whatever reason, I saw a series of books on the shelf, and they caught my eye. Something about the covers. And I know, don't judge a book by its cover, but we all do it. And for whatever reason, there was one book in particular that appealed to me, so I pulled it off the shelf, and I checked it out. And when I started reading it, it was as if a switch just got flipped inside of my head. All of a sudden, instead of just seeing the words on the page, I could actually see the things that they represented. So instead of just seeing the word for sun, I could see the sun in my head. I could almost hear what the characters were saying. I could almost smell the locations. It was a pretty magical experience. And in a lot of ways, I think that reading really is the closest thing we have to magic in the world today, because with the right book, you can be sitting in a chair or on a sofa or on the floor or whatever, and at the same time, you could be riding in a spaceship around Mars, or riding a wild moose in the Yukon, or living someone else's life from 1,000 years ago. And there's really nothing else that lets us do that. Unfortunately, I can't remember what that book was about that got me into reading. I've tried. All I remember is that it was like a children's mystery novel, and it involved tomato sauce being mistaken for blood, which seemed like the most thrilling thing ever to me when I was that age. So from that moment on, I absolutely fell in love with reading, and I read everything I could get my hands on. I was one of those kids that would go to the library and get a stack of books like this on Monday, and I'd be back on Sunday to get a new stack of books. And the librarians they started noticing, and they started giving me books, and they say, it's like slipping me illicit things. I was like, here, try this one. And I liked them all except for when they gave me those choose your own adventure books, because the problem for me is I wanted to follow all the different paths and track them. So I'd end up reading the book like this, marking all the pages, which was annoying. So I was reading and reading as I was growing up, and eventually I graduated from high school. Now, as I mentioned, I was homeschooled my whole life. My mom is a trained Montessori teacher, which is pretty awesome. And I graduated from high school early because we never took any summer breaks. Thank you, Mom. I graduated at 15, and when I graduated, my first thought was, oh man, no more school. This is going to be awesome. And it was awesome for about 2 weeks. And then I got really, really, really bored. You have to understand, I grew up in rural Montana in the 90s. We had no television reception. We had no internet. We didn't even really have radio reception. All we had were books and reading. And I mean, our nearest neighbor lived a half mile away, and they were in their 50s and ran a construction company. So they weren't going to be playing with me. The nearest town was Livingston, Montana, which was a 30-minute drive away and had 6,000 people, and I didn't drive. So there was literally nothing to do, which is like the best thing ever for your imagination. But as I said, so I don't know what to do. So I did what any normal, rational person would do, and I went into our backyard, and I started to dig a hole. And it was a big hole, too. It was like from here to about here. And it was circular. And 9 feet deep. Through solid gravel. It's 20 years later. I'm still proud of that hole. And once I dug that down, then we had this giant old satellite dish abandoned on our property. For those of you who are younger, satellite dishes, like television satellite dishes, used to be enormous. This thing was like 12, 13 feet across. So I dragged it across to that hole and tipped it over on top of it to form a roof on top of the hole. And then I took a bunch of hay bales, because I live in the middle of nowhere in Montana, there's hay bales everywhere, and I piled the hay on top of the satellite dish for insulation, and then I started ripping dead bark off of dead trees that stood along the Yellowstone River, which ran by our house, and I used the dead bark to make shingles on top of the hay bales, on top of the satellite dish, on top of the hole. Now you might be wondering how I got inside of the hole with all that piled on top. Well, again, I did what any normal, well-adjusted person would do, and I dug a tunnel into the hole. And then I started chopping down those dead trees that I got the bark off of. And mind you, I didn't have an axe. I didn't have a hatchet, and I didn't have a saw. So I chopped those trees down with a claw hammer. And I dragged them up into our yard and started planting them upright in front of the entrance to the tunnel to form the framework for what was going to be a Viking-style mead hall. Now, when you start digging hobbit holes and building Viking-style mead halls in your backyard, you are officially bored. And I realized that I needed to find something to do with myself aside from digging giant holes. The thing is, though, it was an amazing experience, and it's an experience I think everyone ought to have at least once in their life. A chunk of time where you're not being forced to do anything. I wasn't in school. I didn't have a job. The only things I had to worry about were chores around the house, and for the rest of the time, I could do what I wanted. And whatever it is you choose to do when no one's telling you what to do, just might be what you should pursue as a career. You know, whether that's reading or writing or being with other people or working with machines or playing video games or making video games or math or science or whatever it might be. In my case, I decided I loved stories so much, I wanted to try to write the sort of story I enjoyed reading. You also have to keep in mind that we had one of these old Carnegie libraries in our local town, and it didn't have the biggest sci-fi fantasy selection. And I read all of it. And I wasn't the smartest kid, so I thought that I had basically read all the science fiction and fantasy that existed. So the only solution would be to write some more. So I decided to, as I said, try to write the sort of book I would enjoy reading myself. And what I loved reading about were riding dragons and fighting monsters. So I spent, about 2-3 months working out the world of the inheritance cycle, working out the story, working out the plot, before I even started writing that first book. Now, I'd tried writing stories before, but I was never able to get past that first 5 or 10 pages because I never had the story, I never had the plot. And this time, though, I put the work in and I got the framework for what was going to be the series. Writing the first draft was fun. Everyone who tells you writing is hard and torturous, no. It was easy because I had no idea what I was doing. In fact, I didn't even know how to type. I wrote the first 60 pages by hand with a ballpoint pen. And then I learned how to type by having to input that in the computer because no one was going to do that for me. And after you do 60 pages of handwritten fiction, yeah, you can type. And the problem was our computer that we had was a Mac Classic. If you've ever seen one of those, you know what it looks like. It was black and white. And my dad had splurged on the expensive model. It had 2 megabytes of RAM instead of 1. But the problem was, as I wrote Eragon, the file size got so big that I could not open the file without crashing the computer. So I had to divide the book into 2 parts because combined it was about 2 megabytes. Which, by the way, still holds to this day. I don't know what goes on in the coding with the files of like MS Word and others, but to this day, a book of about the length of Eragon or Eldest or Murtagh still ends up being about 2 megabytes. So go figure. So they let me use the advanced computer, the Mac Classic, with the 2 megabytes of RAM. Mind you, my friend growing up, he had a Windows computer that was in color. So, he got to play Doom. So I wrote the first draft, and when I finished, I printed it out, and I decided, I always heard that you're supposed to read your own writing, right? It's for some reason. No, the authors never really explain this, but you're supposed to read your own writing and see if you can fix anything. But I thought, okay, I'll do this, and I'm really excited because I'm getting to read my own book for the first time. Well, it took me about 20 pages to realize that it was awful. It was horrible. And just to give you an idea of how bad that first draft was, in the very first draft of Eragon, Eragon wasn't named Eragon. Eragon was named Kevin. Which, by the way, if any of you are named Kevin, it's a great name, but I don't think the series would have been half so successful if it had been about the adventures of the great dragon rider, Kevin. Kevin also encountered a unicorn in the mountains going to the dwarves, so, there was a unicorn. It's not good. Dragons are better than unicorns. I'll fight to the death over that one. But the thing is, I could see that the book needed help, and I was willing to put the work into it. I couldn't walk away from something I had already invested so much effort in. So I spent the better part of a year rewriting, revising, making the book as good as possible, and then I gave it to my parents. And fortunately for me, they liked what I had done enough that they said, yeah, we think you have something here. Let's try self-publishing it. And we knew no one in the publishing industry. So we decided we were going to self-publish. My parents have always been self-employed. They were always looking for ways to work, independent jobs so they could keep the family together and homeschool and pursue sort of an independent life. So the book was a perfect thing for us to work on together as a family business, and it was something I wanted to do as well. So again, we spent the better part of another year editing the book, graphically designing the book, and then getting it actually printed via print on demand. Unfortunately, when the first 50 books showed up, the covers had been cut wrong by the factory. And so the funny thing is they showed up when we were watching Roman Polanski's Macbeth, which was rather fitting. So we had to rip the covers off, burn the insides, and take photographic proof that we had burned the insides of the books, and then ship the covers back for credit. I will admit I kept some of the burnt pages because it was kind of cool to have a book burning with your own book. And then we started taking the book around. I started taking the book around the western half of the United States, and I was cold calling schools and libraries and convincing them to let me come do presentations. And I was doing 2 to 3 one-hour-long presentations every single day for months on end across the western half of the United States. Except back then, I did all of my presentations while dressed in medieval costume. Black knee-high lace-up leather boots, billowy black pantaloons, a big black pirate belt, a billowy red swordsman shirt, and a black beret to top it off. And yes, if you Google young Christopher Paolini, it does come up. Now, the very first event I ever did, the very first presentation I ever did was in our local high school. And they had gathered the entire school into the library. And I was 17. I had never been in a public school before in my life, and I walked in dressed like that. And from the back of the library, I heard some guy go, "Hello, Romeo!" As you can see, I don't wear that anymore. But you do what you have to. So with all of that, the thing is, though, the time that my parents spent helping me prepare the book for publication was time that they weren't working on other freelance jobs that normally they would have been. So by the time we actually had the book printed and we were, and I was out there promoting the book, if Eragon had taken another 2 to 3 months to start turning a profit, we were going to have to sell our house, move to a city, and get any jobs we could. That's how close to the wire we came. We bet everything on it, which makes for a great story now. But when you're living through it and you have no idea if it's going to work out, it's hard to convey the level of sheer terror that was involved there, which is part of the reason I was willing to go out dressed in medieval costume, because it put food on the table. And my parents didn't force any of this on me. This was a joint decision. I wanted to do this. And ultimately, it did pay off, which I'm lucky. Another author, after about a year, a guy by the name of Carl Hyacin, you may be familiar with him as the author of Hoot, as well as many adult novels. He comes up to Montana for fly fishing every year. And while he was up in Montana, he ended up buying a copy of the self-published edition of Eragon for his then 12-year-old son, Ryan. And Ryan liked Eragon so much that his dad passed it off to Random House, and it sort of bounced around the editors there for a couple of months before my editor-to-be, hi, Michelle. My editor-to-be, Michelle, emailed me and said that Random House wanted to buy the series. Which, I love telling this story because to me it really shows the power of readers and reading. If Ryan hadn't read Eragon, and most importantly, if he hadn't liked it, and if he didn't say that he liked it, I wouldn't be standing here today. I'm sure Eragon would have gotten published eventually, but not in the way it was, not at the time it was. And my family didn't have a lot of wiggle room, so I'm very grateful it happened when it happened. And of course, from that point on, everything kind of took off. Random House published Eragon, and then Eldest, Brissinger, and Inheritance, the rest of the series, and now we're all the way up to Murtagh. And it's been a blast the whole way through. With each book, I've had some amazing experiences. I was touring for Eragon, and I had a junior high kid come up to me and try to sell me a lizard. Apparently that was his side hustle. He was breeding these little lizards and selling them as pets, which I respected. When I was getting ready to tour for Eldest, well, actually, I was supposed to supposed to be packing for the tour, and I was actually playing video games. I was playing this old Star Wars game called Jedi Knight Academy 2, which, by the way, to this date is still the best lightsaber fighting game that has ever been made. And I was really good at it. And I was playing an online match, and some guy logged into the match using the name Eragon. I was like, okay, I have to fight him. So I challenged him to a private duel. We fought, And the horrible thing is, he beat me. And across the screen it said, "You have been killed by Eragon." I was like, I didn't need to see that. And I remember when I was touring for Brissinger, I was up in Michigan and doing a big event, big signing, long signing. It's fairly late, and this woman comes through the signing line, and on her arm, she was carrying a sugar glider. For those who don't know, sugar gliders are kind of like flying squirrels, but they're marsupials, and they're really, really cute. So I looked at her and I said, "Well, that's a really cute animal. Do you mind if I pet it?" And she said, "Oh, sure, go right ahead. He loves strangers." I almost don't have to finish the story, do I? So I reach out and I pet the sugar glider, and it looks up at me, and then it took its hands, because they have hands kind of like a raccoon, and it wrapped its fingers around my finger, and then ever so politely, it began to gnaw on my finger. So I was sitting there, and there's blood running down my finger. And of course, my first instinct is I want to go, but that wouldn't be nice. So I go, "Will you please stop your pet from trying to eat me?" But I am kind of glad it happened, because I'm now one of the few people outside of Australia or Arkansas who can say that I've been chewed on by a marsupial. It's like an achievement on the Xbox, chewed on by a marsupial, 20 points. And then when I was finishing Inheritance, the last book in the series, I was in New York City with editing and revisions, and in the last month or so of working on the series, New York City was hit by both an earthquake and a hurricane. And I kind of took that as a message that, yes, you really do need to finish the book, which I was very happy to do. And now, of course, we've had the short story collection, The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, and now Murtagh, which came out in October. Actually, last year was a fun year, because not only did it last year mark the 20th anniversary of the original hardcover edition of Eragon, I also published my sci-fi novel, Fractal Noise, back in June or July of last year, which marked the first time in my career that this very slow author has ever published 2 books in 1 year. Don't expect me to do it again. I spent 50 days touring last year. That was a lot. So I've been up here yammering for quite a while. As I promised you a couple of readings. You might notice I don't have any books up here, so I'm going to shamelessly steal some from you. Does anyone have a copy of Eragon that I can borrow? If you can get it to me, I will use it, so try not to trip or fall, but thank you. All right. Now, I'm not up here to bore you, so I'm going to keep this short and sweet. Hey, someone signed this book. People shouldn't be writing in my books. True story, I once signed a copy of the Da Vinci Code. I was signing copies of Eragon at Costco, and Dan Brown's books were right next to me, so I was like, okay, I'll sign one. So someone out there is one copy of the Da Vinci Code that I have signed. Sorry, Dan Brown. Okay, so I'm going to read you the very first line of the very first chapter of the very first book in the Inheritance cycle. Wind howled through the night, carrying a scent that would change the world. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Who has Eldest? Anyone have a copy of Eldest? You. I know you. All right. Now, I'm a firm believer that if you're not having fun while you write a book, and actually maybe fun's the wrong word, if you're not interested and engaged with what you're writing, your audience is likely to not be interested or engaged either. So I always try to find things that sort of spark the little neurons in my brain, the little gray cells. And one of the things I really enjoy doing is creating languages for... It is, but I'm going to get it from the back. The problem with writing a series that people read for so long is they end up learning it better than you do. Now, I'm no linguist like Tolkien. I will happily admit that, but I still love creating languages, and I have a lot of fun with it. So the main language I created for the series, of course, is the ancient language, which is the language of magic and power. It's the language the elves use. By the way, I apologize for what's about to happen. Now, I based the ancient language partly on Old Norse, which I think gives it a nice sound and feel. However, and I have this blessing here. This is the elvish blessing that Eragon encounters in the second book. But I have to apologize to you, because I have an absolutely horrendous elvish accent. And that's because in the ancient language, you are supposed to roll your R's on the tip of your tongue the way you would in Spanish or Italian. And I can't do that. In fact, the only way I can roll my R's, I'm sorry for this, is by wiggling my uvula. That's the thing in the back of your throat. So I'm going to wiggle my uvula at you. And I hope you like it, too. Atra sterni onothelduen, raner lifa unin harta onner, undu everinia onovarda. Now, that's not the only language I created for the series, of course. There's a couple others. The other big one is my dwarf language, which I invented from scratch. And honestly, it's my favorite one because it's a really meaty language. You can just sink your teeth into it. So I have a chunk of dwarvish here. This is a very angry dwarf complaining about Eragon and the dragon Saphira being in the mountains where the dwarves live. And here's the thing, is unlike the ancient language, I have an excellent dwarvish accent. And that's because in the dwarf language, you are supposed to roll your R's by wiggling your uvula. So, let the wiggling commence. Thorn Hrithkarach, Thorn Jürgen Karmiter, nos eta Gorath Bastarnag, dur incesti Rakhithen, Jok iswerv as Barzuligor, dur Durgrimst as Schwelden Rak Anuen, Mog Torak Jürgenfren. Thank you. Let me pass that book off to you. All right, who's got a copy of Brissinger? I know some of you do. Ooh. You're old. You don't even have white in your beard yet. All right, Brissinger. Now, as most of you probably have noticed, Brissinger is a rather large book. And like most large books, it has a lot of words in it, and a lot of sentences. There's one sentence that involves a bombulating bumblebee that I probably should have cut, but I didn't. But out of the very many sentences that make up this very large book, there's one in particular that is my absolute favorite. And it's my favorite because, well, to be modest, I think it's really well written. In fact, I think that when I wrote this sentence, I leveled up as an author. And I think it has a lot of literary merit, and it seems only appropriate to read it at this festival. So do you want to hear my absolutely favorite sentence from Brissinger? Yeah? All right, here goes. Die, puny human! Because what is the point of writing epic fantasy if you can't write lines like die, puny human every once in 1,000 pages? No point whatsoever. All right, inheritance. Thank you much. Can I sign it for you?
For my son.
For your son. What's his name?
Elijah.
Elijah. Usual spelling?
Yeah.
All right. Of course. There we go. When I first got published, my very first event that I ever did was San Diego Comic-Con, which is an insanely big event if you've ever been to it. And the very first panel I ever did was with Terry Brooks, China Mieville, Peter David, if you know who he is, and I think one other folks, and me, and it was called Fantasy Tropes, or Tropes in Fantasy, and I was 19. I had no idea what I was doing. And Terry Brooks was incredible. He was such a gentleman, and he pulled me over after and gave me all sorts of life advice and writing advice, all of which has proven helpful over the years. And one of the things he told me is, he said, never be upset when someone asks you to sign a book. He said, you start worrying when they stop asking you to sign a book. Now, I am going to read you the very first line of the very first chapter of the very last book of the Inheritance Cycle. The dragon Saphira roared, and the soldiers before her quailed. Thank you. Which always makes me think that Saphira or the soldiers turned into quails, but that's just me. All right, I think we will skip the fork, the witch, and the worm. Most people did. I kid. And who has a copy of You have a copy of Murtagh. I'm going to steal that from you. Okay. All righty. Now, if I can find, I'm going to have to do this one-handed. I think I know which page I'm looking for. Almost there. Almost there. Almost there. There we go. You'd think I'd have this completely memorized after touring for this for, like 2 months last year. So I'm going to read you a short excerpt. This is a little longer than the other ones. This is a proper reading. This is about a page and a half from Murtagh. There shouldn't be any major spoilers in this one, aside, and I apologize from this, aside from the fact that Murtagh and Thorn are alive. So, sorry for that. But I think that this does a good job of sort of capturing the feel of the book and some of what's going on in Murtagh's head. So here we go. If you want to follow along, this is on page 75. Careful to be quiet, Murtagh stood, picked up Zarok from by his blanket, and walked a ways from their camp. The frost-laden grass crunched under his boots, a crisp, dry sound. He stood in an expanse of empty sward, chest up, shoulders back, staring forward into the future. An intake of frozen air, and he swept Zarok from its crimson sheath. In dawn's gray light, the sword's blade was a sharpened shard of iridescent red, a shimmering thorn of frozen blood, eager to cut and stab and kill. The blade of a rider, forged out of bright steel by an elven smith over a century past, and imbued with spells of strength and keenness and resistance. The finest weapon a warrior could hope to wield, and yet he regarded it with as much aversion as appreciation. A rider's blade, yes, but that rider had been Morzan, his father. And Morzan had used Zarok for many a black and bloody deed, as had Murtagh after him. Not for nothing had Morzan named the blade Misery in the ancient language, and true to its name, the sword had brought pain to many throughout the land, including Murtagh himself. Sometimes he wondered if he should have ever taken Zarok from Eragon. He shook off the thought. Whether he wanted it or not, Morzan's shadow would always lie upon him, and aside from his name and the scar on his back, Zarok was all he had from his father. It was a meager and hateful inheritance, but it was his alone, and for that, he clung to it. He held the sheath in his offhand as he flowed through the familiar forms. Step, cut, parry, turn, block, swing, lunge. He moved without thinking, his mind as still and empty as a windless lake on a cloudless day. Attack, defend, escape, beat and break, search the opening, make the cut, risk the stab. He used the sheath as a dagger, blocking, deflecting, wrapping the wrist, creating opportunities for a lethal blow. His skin warmed and his pulse steadied. He moved faster, pushing himself to maintain the pace of battle, every movement a whip snap of life-preserving, life-ending action. His lungs gave out before his arms. Unable to continue, he fell to his knees and braced the sheath against the ground. Zarok he placed across his thighs. As the first rays of light crept across the frozen grass, the egg-shaped ruby in Zarok's pommel refracted the beams, splitting them into glowing darts of red. Once his breath steadied, he stood, sheathed the blade, and staggered back to camp. Across the dead fire, Thorn watched. He sniffed as Murtagh came close. "You stink of fear." Murtagh grunted. "I know. I'll wash." He flinched as Thorn licked his elbow. Then he forced himself to relax and patted the dragon's head. Thank you. Thank you. By the way, for those of you who don't know, the whole reason that Murtagh exists is because of one of you. I mean, it might not be one of you literally, but metaphorically. A couple of years ago, I was on Twitter, far later than I should have been. I mean, do we still call it Twitter? And someone tweeted me. They didn't X me. They tweeted me. Does that make them a twit? No, it doesn't. Anyway, someone tweeted me pretty late, and I was pretty sleep deprived and a little punch drunk. So they said, Christopher, can you tell us something about what Murtagh and Thorn are up to after the inheritance cycle? And again, it was late for me, and so I was a little silly, and I wrote back and I said, oh, well, Murtagh just enchanted a fork to be more deadly than any sword, and Thorn's not too happy with him. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so I wrote a short story based off of that. And when The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, which is where that story is, when that got published, I was in New York City, and I had dinner with my editor. And I remember telling her, saying, Michelle, I think I can get a whole book out of this. I think I have a book. And she said, write it. Do it. And of course, I did. And yes, there will be many more books in the world of Eragon. Murtagh is just the first step of many that are planned. Thank you. In fact, for those of you who don't follow me on social media, A, what's wrong with you? B, I just recently released the world map for the world of Eragon. And one of the pieces of art that is in the deluxe edition of Murtagh is a really beautiful rendition of that world map, and it's more of a sort of a historical projection, globular projection. It's really, really gorgeous. So I have my entire world laid out before you, and the reason I waited so long to do this is because I knew that once I actually showed you the map, I couldn't change anything. So I really had to think about how I was going to shape the world and how that was going to affect the stories I wanted to tell. But I committed to it. I am committed. I have laid the line down, and hopefully it will lead to some very interesting stories. Unfortunately, we are nearly out of time here, but I'd love to answer a couple of quick questions before we truly run out of time. So there are microphones here if you want to run up, and we're going to do some speed Q&A. So,
hey there. Thanks a lot for coming. I read a little bit of the Fractalverse too, and it's interesting because it's very different than your Alagaësia series. I was wondering if you could tell a little bit about the rhythms of creativity. What was it like to step back and then come back to this world that you've created?
All of the tools necessary for telling stories apply to science fiction and fantasy equally. All of the world building is the same. The biggest thing is that spaceships don't go any faster if you dig in your spurs. And committing to that technology and that physics really had a big influence on the shape of the story. In fact, the guy who helped me develop those physics and the FTL technology is here. Greg, hold up your hand. Where are you, Greg? There you are. Without Greg's help, I would not have I wouldn't have my FTL drive and all of the knock-on technology in there. So, yeah.
Thanks.
So you are the holder of the world record for youngest person ever to publish.
Just try to take it.
So would you have any tips or tricks to share for publishing and writing a book?
So your greatest advantage is your lack of experience. Your greatest disadvantage is your lack of experience. There's no way around it. You can't force experience. So I was lucky enough that the story I chose to focus on was a standard epic coming-of-age monomyth story. And that gave me a framework of a story that I knew worked. And then I could focus on my weaknesses, which were prose and character and all of that. So having that structure saved me. And I really believe that plot is incredibly important. If you can get a solid plot, weak writing will not sink your chances. But the main thing is to write, get lots of editing, accept you're not going to get it perfect, and keep revising.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I have no idea how often you've been asked this question, but I think a lot of us might be eager to hear a little bit more about the show, Eragon.
Oh, yes. So Disney Plus is in the process of adapting Eragon as a big budget television show, which is delightful given that Eragon's never been adapted before.
Don't talk about it.
And I am attached as both executive producer and co-writer. And I cannot tell you what's been going on behind the scenes, aside from to tell you the fact that I have personally written 4 scripts this year, which is why there isn't a new book this year. But things are happening, and hopefully we will actually have a decision in the next couple of months whether or not the first season actually gets greenlit or not. And if it gets greenlit, the news will be everywhere. So that's where we're at.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
One of my favorite things about the inheritance cycle is the idea of true names and how that kind of runs through the books. I just wanted to know where you got that theme and kind of what that means to you.
It's an old thing from mythology, the idea that names have power. Ursula Le Guin famously played with it in her fantasy as well in the Wizard of Earthsea trilogy, but she's not the first to invent it either. So that's where it was drawn from, and as a writer, I'm enamored with the language, and the idea that names and words have actual power is honestly pretty appealing to me. So that's pretty much it.
Great, thank you.
Glad you like it.
The poet Malcolm Guite writes that science helps our reason to comprehend, but that art helps imagination to apprehend or just to catch a glimpse of truths beyond the physical. What has creating the world of Alagaësia helped you to apprehend?
Writing is my way of purging the things that I don't want to think about, and also functioning and grappling with and understanding the hard questions of life. And also creating moments of beauty and wonder that make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. So it's my way of understanding the world through story, and thus is an incredibly important part, not just of my career, but also just me as a functioning human being. I mean, any writer who writes for a long time is doing it for personal reasons. You're not doing it for monetary reasons. And if I never sold another book in my life, I'd still be writing privately for that reason.
Yeah, it shows.
Thank you. Thank you.
Here's a question from over here. Why a fork specifically? Was there some specific reason, or is it comedy?
Why a fork specifically? Because it's funny. And it's pointy. And unless you're the Sheriff of Nottingham, fighting with a spoon is very difficult.
Related to the question on true names, I was wondering if you had any tips for coming up with a magic system that's both coherent, but then also interesting and a little different than things that came before.
Great question. It's the same way you come up with technologies for science fiction. You need to decide how you are going to break physics. And it could be something very small, like saying your living creatures can physically manipulate energy with their will and their minds and their intention. That's what my magic is. Or it could be, you need to pray to this god in this way in order to get this effect. That's a paladin or, a monk or something like that. Whatever it is, commit to it and then never break those rules, and then explore all the consequences. Think of it like a video game. Everyone knows about speedrunners and people finding exploits. That's what we do with science. Science is speedrunning the world, and you want to let your characters be smart enough to find all of the exploits. I mean, just look what people can do in Minecraft. They build computers in Minecraft and all sorts of crazy stuff. It's the same principle. So that would be, and at the same time, you can also say my magic is mythic. There's no explanation. It just happens. That's kind of how Tolkien's works. That's maybe the hardest type of magic to write, but also makes the most beautiful at times. It's because it's not mechanistic, it's not scientific. So just find some way of breaking physics and then stick with it.
Thank you.
So I love listening to audiobooks, and I love, when the reader has sort of their own voices for characters. When you're writing, is that part of your character making process, coming up with voices for these characters?
To a degree, but I'm not really great as an audio learning, or I'm not I don't have great musical tone or tempo. So I tend to go more based off the patterns of the words on the page, more versus actually hearing a sound, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I think I speak on behalf of everyone that we're absolutely thrilled to have more books in the world of Eragon coming. And I just wanted to ask if you're able to say if you have any plans for maybe a prequel book about Glitter and Ormus.
No, of course not. The prequel book's about Brahm.
Even better. Thank you so much.
Am I about to get yanked off the stage? One more question. All right.
At the end of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, you mentioned you had to rewrite a significant portion of the book. Could you talk a little about what that process was like for you?
Painful. It was painful. I got cocky after the end of the Inheritance Cycle and thought I knew what I was doing and that I didn't have to put in the basic work that I put in with the Inheritance Cycle because I'd written a best-selling series and everyone loved my writing. And so I started writing To Sleep in a Sea of Stars without the sort of roadmap I had for the Inheritance Cycle. And as a result, it took me almost 6-7 years to write the sucker versus Murtagh, where I had a good plan. It took me 3.5 months. So basically the characters just weren't working and their stories weren't working. If you've read To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, everything after when she gets to the Wallfish was written from scratch. She did not go to Nidus. There were no nightmares. There was no Orsted Station. There was no the planet she goes to at the end of the story. None of that was in the book. All of that had to be rebuilt and restructured. It was incredibly painful because the size of the book is massive. And so, I would edit 400 pages. And I'm like, I'm not even halfway through the book. I just finished a book. I'm not halfway through the book. Which is why future books will be split in 2 or shorter. Hopefully. I could talk a lot more about that, but I think they're about to drag me off the stage here. So I would love to keep answering your questions, but I just want to say thank you so much for reading the books. If you get a chance, pre-order Murtagh, the deluxe edition, if you're interested. Please seek me out on social media to keep up with my various news. But most of all, thank you for reading the books. I write them for you. It means so much that you read them. Go forth, be awesome, and as Eragon himself would say, Sioners Verdar Sitya Havas, may your swords stay sharp. Thank you.